Arab Spring in 2011, and I was watching television. It's kind of an amazing event. You saw on Tahrir Square mass riots and people begging for the end of the Hosni Mubarak regime. I saw an interview with two young women. They were lesbians, admittedly, and they were rioting to remove Mubarak and to replace him with the Muslim Brotherhood. And the question the reporter asked is, why in the world would you support the Muslim Brotherhood? Aren't you lesbians? They said, oh, absolutely, but they're such good organizers, and we're going to stand with them because they're going to bring us freedom. And I don't know what happened after that. I'm sure it was tragic. When the Muslim Brotherhood took over, oh my goodness. But have you ever wondered why it is that radical progressives and really Sharia supremacists seem to work together? Why do they do that? It makes no sense to me. Well, today in the Economic War Room, we have a special guest. It's Jim Simpson. He's the author of the book, Red Green Axis 2.0. And I'd like for him to explain why these groups seem to work together and what it means for the United States. Welcome, Jim.
Hey, great to be with you, Kevin.
So glad.
Thanks for having me.
Oh, we're so glad to have you here. So, you wrote this new book. It's Red Green Axis 2.0, and it talks about Sharia supremacism and radical progressive leftists. I don't understand, why do those two groups seem to work together? But before we get there, I want you to share, what does Red Green Axis mean?
Sure, of course. Well, the Red Green Axis is the collusion between the Reds, which are communists, the socialists, the leftists of all stripes, and the Green, which are the Islamists. The Muslim Brotherhood primarily, with the Organization for Islamic Cooperation, all of the various large Muslim Brotherhood and Muslim organizations that are intent on imposing Sharia throughout the world.
Now, I get this whole idea of red. I mean, I remember growing up, the anti-communist push, better red than dead, you know, and you know, we all better dead than red. Yeah, exactly. But with that, the idea was, didn't communism get knocked out? Didn't we win? The Cold War's over. Isn't communism done?
Well, you know, that's what they said back in 1991, but it certainly doesn't look that way, does it?
No.
Throughout South and Central America, there's a huge resurgence in communism. Throughout most of the African nations, communism has essentially taken over.
And the world's most populous country, China, is communist. No doubt. So, what if that's red? Why do we call the Islamists green?
Well, the green is, I chose that because green is very prominent color in Islamic tradition. If you look at most of the flags for Muslim nations, they have some component of green, and the green is a prominent color in Islamic tradition. That's just the best way to put it.
So modern thinking, as you hear green, you think of the green movement, the environmentalism,
yeah.
But that really fits under the red, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. Absolutely.
Yeah. All right, so tell me a little about your background.
Sure.
I saw that you were at the Office of Management and Budget, which is like one of the most powerful offices in all of Washington. What did you do there?
Well, it's kind of overrated, but yes, it's the president's personal budget staff that helps him create the annual president's budget proposal to Congress, which he usually unveils at the State of the Union address. But the way things have been lately, they pay very little attention to it. But OMB essentially oversees the federal government budget.
What president was there?
President Reagan. It was the end of Reagan's term.
Was Jim Miller the budget director then?
He absolutely was.
Yeah,
I got to know him pretty well. Yeah.
Good man.
Great man. Yes, great.
All right, and you're also an investigative journalist.
Yes.
And tell us, what have you investigated?
What haven't I investigated? Maybe a better way to look at it. You know, I started, like many people, I was inspired by 9/11 to jump back in. I had a private business that had nothing to do with politics for many years after I left the government. A successful business. But I decided that I could stay silent no longer after 9/11 happened. So I began blogging, like many people. And because I had that expertise from OMB and my economics background, plus a basic lifelong application of military history and intelligence issues, I was pretty well placed to start making a name for myself in the blogosphere, and that gradually evolved into a writing career. Well, now I've written a number of books, and I've published articles in practically every conservative journal that you can name on vote fraud, immigration, the Cloward-Piven strategy.
Let's talk about the Cloward-Piven strategy, because that came up and became prominent during the Obama years.
Yep.
It seemed like there was this massive move. Well, describe it. It's to overwhelm the system.
Sure.
Describe what your strategy is.
Well, Cloward and Piven, Richard Cloward and Francis Fox Piven were two sociology professors at Columbia University at the time. They're both radical socialists. I mean, radical in this sense.
Far red. This
Far,
is part of the red-green. They're
Yes,
the red.
very red. They were founding members of the Democratic Socialists of America, which is not democratic or socialist. It is the biggest, most prominent today communist organization in the country, and we can talk about that some later.
That's
but anyway.
the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez.
Yes,
That's
yes.
Bernie Sanders.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. So in 1966, they came out with an article called "The Way to the Poor: A Strategy to Remove Poverty," or a strategy to reduce poverty. And their idea was to pack the welfare rolls with so many people that government would literally collapse, and in the ashes they could create a proposed socialist, redistributivist government.
It's a chaos strategy.
It's a chaos strategy. It's exactly right. Create chaos so that you can take advantage of it. And their goal at that point was to erect a national standard income for everybody, whether you work or not. But it begs the question, if their goal was to pack the welfare rolls and overwhelm government, how is it that creating even more government through a standard income could make anything better, right? It would just make matters worse. So their answer was, it just proved really what they were all about, which is destruction. And since then, that strategy has been applied to immigration. Cloward and Piven were the authors of the Motor Voter Law, the National Voter Registration Act in 1993, signed by President Clinton, which has created chaos in our voting system. It gave ACORN, which Cloward and Piven also created using their one of their people that Richard Cloward had mentored, Wade Rathke, to start ACORN. They used ACORN to attack the voting system through massive fraudulent registrations, and ACORN was very heavily involved in the subprime mortgage crisis, which I argue was also another Cloward-Piven strategy. And the latest is immigration, overwhelming our borders with just our entire country, frankly, with countless problems.
All of this led up to President Barack Obama. All of it led up to massive change in our society, the way that we view things. Even the words that we're allowed to use have been changed because of this Cloward-Piven strategy. And you're the guy that brought this to the attention of people like Glenn Beck. I just talked about it. So that's amazing. And you're now talking about how the red side, which is the Cloward and Piven and all the Democratic Socialists, are coming together with the radical Sharia supremacist green side.
Yeah.
So is this what constitutes the squad?
And absolutely, they are the poster children for the red-green axis. Two Muslims, Rashida Tlaib and Ilhan Omar, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ayanna Pressley, the two Reds.
Yeah. And they work together, they have each other's back, they're pushing society as far as they can. How about Antifa?
Well, Antifa is really the face of the left. They give themselves, a few degrees of separation. But I mean, as you've seen, even Frido Cuomo said that Antifa is doing great stuff. They are the street thugs working on behalf of the red-green axis. They are the terrorists who are imposing the red-green axis agenda, or at least threatening to, trying to, by force.
Wow. So I was at the inauguration for President Trump, and I saw all of the march against the president. I saw all of this combination,
Yeah.
radical feminists,
Yeah.
combined with people, women who were under wearing, traditional Islamic garb.
Yeah.
And I thought, that doesn't fit together for me. But
Yeah.
that's kind of an example of this red-green,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Well, it's interesting. In 2003, Osama bin Laden, in an interview that was broadcast on Al Jazeera, said, in the interests of our agenda, which is essentially spreading Islam throughout the world, we see no problem in colluding with the socialists, even though we recognize that the socialists are infidels. He said that. Now, I'm paraphrasing, but that's exactly what he said.
I think I have another practical example
Yeah.
of red-green at work. Very recently, I was with Michelle Malkin, who is a former CRTV host,
Right.
and we were on CRTV
Sure.
at the time. It's now Blaze TV.
Yeah.
And she was going to be speaking at Mar-a-Lago, which is the president's president's club in Florida, for Brigitte Gabriel. And two groups, CARE and the SPLC, protested that, and she got kicked out,
Yep.
literally.
Yep.
So tell us about CARE and the SPLC.
Well, CARE, as a lot of your viewers probably know, the Council on American Islamic Relations, is actually the United States front for the Palestinian terrorist group Hamas. And that's not disputable. I mean, that is...
Is that why the United Arab Emirates in 2014 declared them a terrorist group? Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. And it's not disputable.
So it's not anti-Muslim to
No.
call CARE out, because the Muslims in the United Arab Emirates have done that.
Well, let me give you a few examples of that. Because, for example, when ISIS and Al-Shabaab, the Somali terrorist group Al-Shabaab, were recruiting Muslims in the United States, primarily, or the largest recruitment effort was going on in Minneapolis, Minnesota. CARE warned Somali Muslims not to tell the FBI that was going on. And the Somali Muslims called out CARE publicly, saying that CARE was facilitating the recruitment of their sons for ISIS and Al-Shabaab. And they protested them publicly. They said, CARE out. CARE is fraudulent.
So it's not anti-Muslim to call CARE for what they
No,
are.
no.
But yet CARE holds itself out as it's some holy group that's protecting the civil liberties. They're not
Well,
a civil liberties group for Muslims.
They're not civil liberties at all. They are, I argue that they are a terrorist group. If not, they're not engaged in terrorism in the United States, but they are definitely engaged in facilitating terrorist activities. And I believe that what the Muslims in Minnesota said was true. And much of the lawfare they engage in is designed to hobble law enforcement's efforts against Islamic terrorists. Like, for example, the imams that tried to board an airplane in Phoenix, Arizona, and they were doing all kinds of suspicious stuff deliberately. It was a provocation. It was an obvious provocation. Law enforcement threw them off, and of course, CARE sued.
Yeah.
CARE sued. But, let me get to the nexus between CARE and SPLC,
So yeah, that's
this is very interesting.
green
here.
side.
Yeah.
Tell me about the red side.
So, the CARE's favorite term now is Islamophobia.
Okay.
And if you say the words Islamic terrorism, if you say jihadi terrorism, if you say violent jihad, any of those
Sharia
words,
supremacists.
any of those words are by definition Islamophobic, and you have to stop your hate.
Even if you're Muslim. And you say,
It doesn't matter. One of the Somali Muslims from Minnesota that called out CARE was listed as an Islamophobe in their 2013 Islamophobia report. simply for calling them out. His nephew was murdered by al-Shabaab for not wanting to join.
Right, so they use that term. And I know the SPLC, by the way, didn't they get sued by a Muslim?
Yes, a Muslim moderate for being a radical, they called him radical. But here's the thing, Islamophobia is just the latest invented term that the left and its Islamist allies use to marginalize their opponents. And the SPLC learned this tactic. Now here's where it gets interesting. Lenin said, we must write in a language that inspires hate, revulsion, and scorn towards those who disagree with us. That Lenin said that in the 1920s. Okay? Vladimir Lenin, first Soviet leader. They pushed that narrative out to the communist parties of the world throughout the following decades, saying, if your opponents give you too much trouble, call them Nazis, call them anti-Semites, call them any name that already is associated with a bad smell in the public mind, and after a while it would become true in the public mind.
So how does this SPLC
get into it. So Herbert Marcuse was a member of the Communist Frankfurt School in Frankfurt, Germany, came to the United States, took over the Columbia Teachers College, and began teaching future college professors all the radical Marxist, cultural Marxism, what we now know as cultural Marxism.
Which is pretty much taking over teachers' colleges.
Absolutely. Marcuse created a concept called partisan tolerance, which is tolerance of the left ideas only and complete intolerance of the right. His definition included intolerance right down to thought. So in other words, his plan was, he said that the left didn't get enough publicity in the 60s. And so in order for the left to get its ideas across, there had to be a complete suppression of ideas that opposed it, just like what Lenin said, right? So it was complete suppression of ideas from the right and allowance only of ideas to the left. It became known as partisan tolerance. Marcuse worked very closely with Julian Bond, which was the co-founder and lifelong board member of the Southern Poverty Law Center. Okay? Worked closely. They co-founded In These Times, communist newspaper. They worked on the National Council for New Politics, which was labeled a communist group by a sitting senator at the time. They worked together for years. Marcuse mentored Angela Davis. Julian Bond very much supported Angela Davis, even writing the foreword to her book. And so they worked for years.
This is the beginnings of the extreme radicalism that led to the SPLC.
Marcuse's partisan tolerance was transferred to the Southern Poverty Law Center, and it became the institutional home for that strategy of silencing opponents. And that's what it's been
they just
ever
label
since.
People, you're
Haters.
a hate group.
You're a hater.
And so they just try and cut you off. So with that, weren't they just recently discredited? Washington Post ran a story. They have a bad history of treating their employees badly. There are other things too, right?
So much. Morris Dees was accused for many years of not merely poorly treating his employees, racial discrimination, sexual harassment. I read his divorce papers from the 70s. What he did to his wife and his family is almost indescribable, at least according to them.
Yeah, and yet this group is amassed
$500 million.
$500 million.
$500 million.
And they keep it offshore.
They keep a lot of it offshore. Yep, and they had said when they reached 50 million in assets, they were going to quit because that would be enough. But they don't quit. They just keep raising money. And Morris Dees was making about $350,000 a year. He was doing quite well.
All right, so we've got the red and the green axis working together. And in your book, you talk about mostly immigration.
Yep.
And that's the next push here.
Yep.
So walk us through the caravans. Are they in any way tied to the red-green axis?
The caravans pretty much are the red-green axis. I mean, you have to think what happened in Europe was not a mistake. What happened in Europe was a deliberate strategy, I believe, masterminded by the Russians to essentially invade and overtake Europe with a massive cloud-driven strategy.
Cloud-driven.
And it was facilitated by Angela Merkel, who most people think is a West German conservative leader. She was born and raised in East Germany, and she was a communist youth leader. She has never changed her stripes, and you see the destruction that it's caused throughout Europe. The migrant caravans were the follow-on to that. The migrant caravans were not spontaneous. They're heavily organized. There are dozens of tax-exempt groups from America and from Central America working to help them. And the biggest organization that people don't know is working down there. There are 5 UN agencies facilitating the migrant caravans to the
So
border.
this is the United Nations, this
United
is a
Nations.
cloud-driven strategy. It's also left-wing groups. There's some taxpayer funding, I would
A
imagine.
lot of tax, for example, Centro Sin Fronteras, which is the funding group for Pueblo Sin Fronteras, which is the on-the-ground small organization from Chicago.
So this includes religious groups too,
Yeah,
right?
yeah. So, for example, the Catholic Legal Immigration Network, Clinic for short, receives government for the funding, and it works closely with these organizations. The Ford Foundation provided $2.9 million since 2011. The Illinois Coalition for Immigrant and Refugee Rights is 80% funded by the Illinois government. They provide...
Which is bankrupt, essentially.
Yes. That doesn't matter to them. They find the money somehow, and they provide, in turn, provide money to Centro Sin Fronteras, which, and it's this shell game, because it starts at one place and then goes to another, then goes to another, and goes to another, and the final endpoint are these small tax exempts who may be getting a few $100,000 each that have activists on the ground doing the groundwork, but there's huge money behind it. And let me add, the biggest UN agency working the border down there is the UN High Commissioner for Refugees. Guess how much money the UN High Commissioner for Refugees gets from American taxpayers? 37% of its total budget comes from U.S. taxpayers. China and Russia, who conceivably become the biggest beneficiaries of the collapse of our nation, provide 0.4%.
We're funding our own attack, right?
Yeah, we are.
So why don't we hear the facts on all this? Why is it that I mean, immigration's a big issue. It's a hot button issue at every kitchen table. It is a hot button issue in Europe. And yet, if you bring up the idea of immigration, I guess the SPLC is ready to denounce you as a hater, racist,
You're obviously a hater.
bigot.
Well, you know, it's even scarier than that, because the Organization for Islamic Cooperation has pushed blasphemy codes, and they were able to get them inserted in the Migrant Compact that was signed last year by many Western European nations, excluding, thank you, Donald Trump, the United States of America. But the Migrant Compact calls for those nations to erect laws, hate speech laws, against anybody who speaks negatively about migrants. So if our conversation here could land us in jail, because there are so many negative consequences of this mass immigration. I mean, crime, off the charts welfare use, chaos of every description.
And chaos is one you were telling me before we started. How many languages are spoken?
Yeah, that's my favorite. One of the charts in my book describes the number of languages spoken in public schools today in the United States. Over 400.
How do you teach?
How
when
do you
have to
teach?
speak 400
Yeah.
different languages?
Well, you look at any one school, and I have picked out like about 20 or so schools in different districts throughout the United States using their own data, up to 120 languages spoken in some public schools, and up to 30%.
Individual schools,
In
120?
individual schools, up to 30% of the student body not speaking English. And some of those languages aren't even translatable because nobody has ever had any experience with them.
At some point, a stable society needs to have, maybe 5 languages would be a positive move here, but 120?
Yeah, I mean, you can, it's great that we become bilingual or even multilingual. It facilitates all kinds of things for us as individuals, but that's not the purpose here. The purpose here is to create chaos. The purpose here is to make everything so bad that nothing can happen. In Manchester, New Hampshire, for example, the former mayor finally got defeated by a leftist, complained that 82 languages were spoken in Central High School, and Manchester Public Schools, as a consequence, had the lowest school ratings in the state.
Well, of course you can't teach.
You can't teach
have
with
unity.
that.
You can't bring any.
You can't do anything.
Yeah. All right. So where does this head? It sounds like it's heading to chaos.
Yeah.
Certainly, if the red takes over, we have an example of communist China. They're oppressing the Uyghur movement. They've got the Uyghurs, the Muslims in China are being radically oppressed.
Isn't it interesting, though, that you don't see CARE protesting about that? You don't see any of these Islamists talking about how the Uyghurs are oppressed.
Well, go then to a Sharia state, a state that follows Sharia law. The progressives don't have any of the freedoms that they push for and would like to have. They don't have language freedoms. They don't have choices, sexual freedoms, and all that.
There are not too many progressives, I just call them leftists, in any of those countries. They know better.
These two groups that are working together to really bring down America, at some point they go after each other, or is there something else behind it?
I think there's something else behind it. I know organization, and I've studied organizations for years. I ran an organization for years. All organizations have a hierarchy. And the communists do not get involved in any type of arrangement with anybody else when they're not completely 100% confident that they are completely in charge. Now, the top leaders, for example, the top leader, Ali Khamenei in Iran, he was taught at Moscow University. That's where prominent leftists go to learn communist tactics. Other Muslim leaders have also gone there. The second in command, or the current commander of Al-Qaeda, Ayman al-Zawahiri, KGB agent, and that's what Alexander Litvinenko, who was murdered with polonium-210, former KGB agent in the UK, that's one of his big exposés that I believe he was murdered for. And so
ultimately that's why it's red, green, red comes first.
Yeah.
So we got to get down into the practical. We talk about the bad, and there's a lot of bad here. And we like to talk about the good, and then we like to talk about the beautiful.
Sure.
So what can we do about it? Practically, where do people go to get better informed? I mean, we'll talk about your book, but where else can they go to get better informed?
Oh, I'll tell you, the book was published by the Center for Security Policy. I work very closely with them.
Frank Gaffney's a good
Gaffney.
friend. We've had him on the program. I'm actually a senior fellow there.
Oh, great, yeah. The Center for Security Policy website, securefreedom.org, has a wealth of all kinds of information, including a free PDF download of my book. So if you don't want to buy it at Amazon, just go there and get a free download, and many other, books similar to that. There's so many good. Epic Times
Yes.
is an excellent
And we
source.
featured them as well. Epic Times is very good.
My friend Trevor Loudon,
Mm-hmm. Trevor also,
trevorloudon.com,
yep.
he's fantastic with this stuff.
Okay, so let me ask this. Does voting make a difference? I mean, we elected President Trump. Is that making a difference?
That has made the only difference that we've been able to enjoy in recent history, and I believe 2020 is a critical election that will decide the fate of our country. The Squad, Democratic Socialists of America, and the organized Democratic Party is pushing to register 40 million new voters.
Wow, and if they get all this immigration...
We're in Texas right now. We're in Texas right now. Texas is a minority-majority state. The only reason it is not a dark blue state today is because about 80% of the Hispanics that would vote for the left, foolishly, are not registered. And they are out there every day registering those people. Conversely, at the same time, there are 40 million Christians in the United States who are not voting. 15 million of them are not even registered to vote. It's inexcusable.
So what
It's
you're saying is
inexcusable.
voting does matter.
And especially with the level of vote fraud that they are willing to engage in. And the state of Texas has serious issues with that they are not doing anything about. They need to be on top of that. You know, there was something like 100,000 registrations sent out to non-citizens with the U.S. citizenship box checked by the Democratic Party. Paxton picked that up, but that investigation has just fallen off the radar.
Well, we've got to turn that around. Voting does matter. This next election may make all the difference. Trump derangement syndrome is from the SPLC and all that. It's a part of this strategy.
It's a strategy.
Jim, you've written a great book, Red Green Axis 2.0. It's published by the Center for Security Policy. You can get a free download at securefreedom.org. You can buy the book on Amazon. It's well worth having. It's 137 pages of text and, let me see, 446 footnotes and references. So it's extremely well documented. It's a major work. And it is something that we need to really understand, because we're facing a red-green axis, and it's a part of the economic war that we're all battling. So remember what we always say. We say what we see as a marketplace, our enemies view as a battle space. And Jim has shared with us several examples. The most recent is immigration, where we just think, oh, it's a marketplace. There are a lot of American companies that are saying, bring as many people in as we can, we'll make a buck off of this. But our enemies view that as an opportunity to take our nation down if they can. We believe in good legal immigration. It's a part of the history of this country. It's important for our nation, but not a cloud-driven strategy where you can massively bring people in and completely overrun the system and overrun the country. So you need to get your free battle plan at economicwarroom.com. If we work together, if we get the Christians voting, if we bring the patriotic Americans back to the polls, if we stand for what we believe, we can pass on this great nation to future generations. This is Kevin Freeman from the Economic War Room.